November 30th, 1943. Tehran, Iran, beneath the Soviet embassy in a basement that smelled like ink and cold cement. Marshal Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov slowed his pen mid-stroke over an operations report, staring at a sentence he could never put into an official file. Without the 400,000 trucks we are receiving from the Americans, this offensive would be impossible. We are moving our armies on American wheels. Through a small window came the low, steady growl of American-built Studebaker engines rolling through Tehran, hauling Soviet supplies toward the conference where Stalin would sit across from Roosevelt and Churchill. In that pause, a private moment for the USSR's most famous commander, the unspoken truth stood up and refused to leave. The Red Army pushing the Wehrmacht back toward Berlin was riding in American vehicles, burning American fuel, and eating American food. Hours later, at a private dinner, Stalin would lift a glass and, off the record, admit as much. Without this aid, he said in that closed circle, the Soviet Union would have lost the war. By the time the war ended, 427,284 American trucks and jeeps had crossed oceans and deserts to reach Soviet hands, surviving U-boats in the Arctic, the bottlenecks of the Persian Corridor, and the long Pacific route. That was more motor transport than the Soviet Union produced across the entire war, more than most countries owned in total. Those machines didn't just help, they changed the tempo of the Eastern Front. The Red Army went from the pace of boots and horses to the speed of a mechanized avalanche, capable of sustaining action along 1,000-mile fronts. What no one in that Tehran basement could have guessed was that every uncomfortable truth whispered about American aid was being captured twice. Once by American note-takers, and again by the NKVD. A hidden ledger of contradictions took shape, destined to clash with decades of official propaganda about the Great Patriotic War. The real story of Soviet transportation opens with catastrophe. June 22, 1941, 3.8 million Axis soldiers burst across the Soviet border in Operation Barbarossa and found an army ill-equipped for modern, motorized war. The truck fleet, about 700,000 vehicles, leaned on the Gaze AA, a licensed 1930 Ford Model A, and the ZIS-5, itself rooted in 1920s American designs. Within 6 months, 40% of that fleet was destroyed or captured. The numbers were merciless. In 1941, the USSR built 126 trucks and lost almost 300,000. The main truck plant at Gorky had to evacuate east as German units advanced. The ZIS factory in Moscow pivoted to tanks, while the Wehrmacht stood at the city's doorstep. By early 1942, entire Soviet armies were marching on foot. Artillery moved by horses, when horses could be found. The Second Shock Army tried to punch out of the Volkhov pocket and left 95% of its transport behind. Soldiers carried shells on their backs because the guns couldn't be towed anymore. This is the army American aid would rewire, though it would take 40 years for Moscow to say so out loud. The Wehrmacht had already demonstrated the three essentials of modern war: mobility, speed, logistics that work every day, not just in parades. Soviet formations often had more men and more guns, but they were outmaneuvered again and again because they could not match the Germans' operational reach. Infantry divisions that should have been on trucks walked. Artillery that needed sturdy prime movers depended on horses that froze and died by the thousands. October the 1st, 1941. Arkhangelsk, Soviet Arctic. British convoy PQ-1 offloaded in the grim blue light of subarctic autumn. 20 American trucks rolled down ramps and onto Soviet soil, the first trickle of what would become a flood. For drivers used to machines that demanded an hour of wrenching for every hour of motion, these Chevrolets, with enclosed cabs and engines that simply ran, looked like small miracles. By November 1941, while the Wehrmacht stood a dozen miles from the Kremlin, American trucks were arriving at roughly 2,000 a month via multiple paths. The Persian Corridor, managed by American engineers who took over the Iranian State Railway, multiplied its throughput by 600%. The Pacific route, limited to non-military cargo because of Soviet-Japanese neutrality, still moved thousands of vehicles. Arctic convoys, mauled by U-boats and Luftwaffe strikes, kept coming with badly needed cargoes. The machines themselves represented a jump across an engineering gap. The Studebaker US6 had six-wheel drive, all six driven, versus the four wheels and two driven on standard Soviet trucks. Its engine produced 94 horsepower to the ZIS-5 73. Most of all, the trucks arrived with self-recovery winches, pulling themselves out of mud that would swallow Soviet vehicles until spring. Toolkits, complete 128-piece sets, lay in the cab. Hydraulic jacks, tire repair equipment, parts catalogs with numbers for everything. Soviet drivers often received a truck with only basic hand tools, if they got tools at all. The American rigs came with cold-weather starting gear, cab heaters that actually heated, and sealed electrical systems that didn't short in rain or slush. They were designed to work, then keep working. The Tehran Conference ran from November 28th to December 1st, 1943, and produced one of the most striking private admissions of the war, classified in the United States until 1961 and unpublished in the Soviet Union until 1989. On November 30th, Stalin, speaking in a small room with Roosevelt, Churchill, and close advisors, gave credit in a way the world would not hear for decades. Roosevelt's interpreter, Charles Bolin, recorded the essence. The war's most important ingredient was machines, and the United States was a nation of machines, turning out 8,000 to 10,000 aircraft a month, while the USSR could reach at most 3,000. Without Lend-Lease, Stalin said, they would have lost. Field Marshal Alan Brooke noted in his diary that when the conversation turned technical, trucks came up fast. Studebakers were, in Stalin's words, the best for Soviet conditions and the foundation of mobility. 3 years later, in 1946, Stalin told the public a different story. Lend-Lease was merely supplementary, just about 10% of production. That claim hardened into orthodoxy, guarded by censors, repeated by historians who knew better and chose survival. Tehran's papers showed more than toasts. Marshal Klim Voroshilov told American logistics officers plainly, "Your trucks are winning the war for us. One American truck is worth 10 light tanks. In public, heroes of industry. In private, heroes of logistics." Why did trucks matter that much? Arithmetic. A Soviet rifle division on the attack needed around 450 tons a day. Ammo, rations, fuel, medical supplies. On defense, 300. A tank corps could drink 1,000. Pushing that weight from railheads to foxholes across broken roads required motor transport. In 1943, Major General Andrei Krylev, the Red Army's logistics chief, wrote a classified report. The minimum truck requirement for sustained offensive operations was 450,000. Soviet factories produced 49,000 from January to September 1943. American deliveries in that same stretch, 94,000. Without those vehicles, Soviet forces could not operate more than 50 kilometers from rail lines. And it wasn't just how many, it was what they could do. The ZIS-5 and Gaz-AA were nominally 2.53 tonners, but in frontline conditions, they often hauled 1.5 tons before braking. The Studebaker US6 was rated for 2.5 tons and regularly carried 5 on good roads and 3 cross-country. Meantime between failures, 10,000 kilometers against about 2,000 for Soviet models. American trucks brought air brakes that worked in sleet, aluminum pistons that lightened engines, oil filters that filtered, thermostats that kept engines at temp. Soviet trucks ran with mechanical brakes that failed when wet, heavy pistons, settling tanks instead of filters, and temperamental engines, too cold in winter, hot in summer. While the Arctic convoys captured imaginations, the Persian Corridor did the heavy lifting. The route stretched roughly 4,000 miles from American ports through Iran to the Soviet border, one of the great logistics feats in military history. American engineers took over a single-track railway that moved 200 tons a day and cranked it up to 6,000. They threw highways across stretches that once had only camel paths. They built assembly plants in the desert that could process 300 trucks a day. The Andameshk plant turned into an emblem of industrial strength transplanted. Soviet drivers would arrive after punishing rides from the Caucasus, get 3 days of training on American vehicles, and then pilot brand new trucks 1,800 miles back to the front. The culture shock was real. Mechanics who were used to improvising repairs with hammers and baling wire found themselves in a maintenance world with schedules, checklists, and parts that fit right out of a box. By mid-1943, the corridor was moving thousands of trucks a month. The port of Khorramshahr, 50,000 tons in a pre-war year, was pushing 250,000 tons per month during the peak. Soviet liaison officers wrote home in disbelief about ships unloaded in 48 hours when their own ports would take 2 weeks. Estimates suggest that nearly half of all American trucks delivered to the USSR came through Iran. The corridor's efficiency became a classroom for Soviet logisticians. They studied it, copied where they could, but couldn't replicate American industrial depth. Pair those trucks with Soviet rocket artillery, and you get a weapon German soldiers named and feared. The BM-13 Katyusha originally rode ZIS-6 trucks, but that production ended in late 1941. Rail-mounted and towed versions couldn't keep up in mobile war. The Studebaker US6 changed the equation. Its reinforced frame handled the violent pulse of a full volley. Six-wheel drive let crews fire, then vanish before counter-battery fire arrived. Cross-country performance was so good, the platform became standardized in 1943 as the BM-13N. Norm Alice, standardized. Over 1,800 of those Studebaker-mounted launchers rolled out before war's end. Guard units with Studebaker-mounted organs survived at roughly 4 times the rate of those stuck on Soviet trucks. The difference was mine hits that decided life or death. Shoot a salvo and be gone in 3 minutes versus 15. The production math tells its own story. Soviet wartime truck output totaled roughly 205,000. 1941, 46,100 from June 22nd. 1942, 32,300. 1943, 41,600. 1944, 57,400. 1945, 27,600 through May. The American contribution was 427,284 vehicles, more than double. Losses were staggering, nearly 300,000 vehicles in 1941 alone, over 500,000 total across the war. Remove American deliveries, and by mid-1942, the Soviet vehicle park collapses. After Stalingrad, every offensive leaned on American wheels. By 1945, American vehicles were 33% of the fleet, but carried 70% of the Army's transport capacity because they could haul more and break down less. A Studebaker US6 cost about $1,830 to build in 1943. The USSR received them free under Lend-Lease. Building equivalents would have demanded money, raw materials, and factory capacity Moscow needed for tanks and planes. Capacity it simply did not have. June 23, 1944. Operation Bagration. The biggest Soviet offensive of the war smashed Army Group Center and inflicted about 450,000 German casualties. The operation's daily diet was measured in truckloads. Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky's staff calculated that First Belarusian Front needed 12,000 tons a day. Railways could push supplies to depots 100 kilometers behind the line. Trucks had to carry the rest. Rokossovsky had 19,000 trucks, 14,000 of them American. The offensive tore forward 450 kilometers in 5 weeks, outrunning German expectations that the Red Army would have to stop every 150 kilometers to catch its breath. Those German estimates were based on Soviet truck production, not on a quiet tripling of Red Army transport capacity courtesy of Detroit and South Bend. In 5 weeks, American trucks in Soviet service hauled 400,000 tons of ammunition, 300,000 tons of food, and evacuated 250,000 wounded. They burned through 67,000 tons of fuel, moved again, largely by American trucks. Soviet truck production for all of 1944 could not have kept Bagration going for a week. Zhukov left 3 separate confessions about aid, each suppressed until the USSR loosened its grip. In 1963, on a dacha microphone he did not know existed, he said, "The quiet part. People claim the Allies didn't help us, but without American materials, we couldn't have formed reserves or kept fighting. Without American trucks, there was nothing to pull our guns." In 1965-1966, in taped interviews with writer Konstantin Simonov, he went even plainer. Without American Studebakers, our artillery wouldn't move. They were, to a large degree, our frontline transport. In an unpublished manuscript seized in 1969 and locked up until 1992, He wrote that moving 2.2 million artillery shells in 2 weeks for Berlin was possible only because American trucks ran round the clock. Nikita Khrushchev, in a memoir recorded secretly and smuggled west by 1970, reached the same bottom line. One-on-one with Nazi Germany, without U.S. and British aid, the USSR would not have stood. He talked about trucks specifically, no maneuverability without them. And then, in public life, he said the opposite, that Soviet resources alone carried the day. That contradiction became national habit. Soviet mechanics learned the engineering gap in the grease under their fingernails. American engines used aluminum pistons. Soviet engines were heavier. American trucks had real oil filters. Soviet ones used settling tanks that didn't do the job. Sealed bearings in American wheels ran 50,000 kilometers. The Soviet equivalent lasted maybe 5,000. The Americans shipped parts catalogs with precise numbers. You ordered by number, the exact part showed up. In Soviet practice, you cannibalized a dead truck or had parts machined by hand. Safety features, laminated glass, mirrors on both sides, backup lights, a horn you could hit without taking your eyes off the road, seemed almost luxurious. After the war, Soviet engineers absorbed those lessons. The ZIS 150, the first mass-produced truck in the post-war USSR, wore American DNA learned from thousands of Studebakers, preventive maintenance schedules, standardized parts, inspections, habits imported by necessity. The Winter War of 1939-40 had already exposed what happened when logistics collapsed. The Red Army struggled to supply troops a mere 150 kilometers from Leningrad. It suffered 126,175 dead and 264,098 wounded against Finnish forces, a fraction of its size. Marshal Semyon Timoshenko's post-war analysis put trucks near the top of the culprit list. By June 1944, with American vehicles in depth, the Soviet offensive against Finland succeeded precisely because supply lines could cross the same brutal terrain that once beat them. Soviet propaganda would later say rails, not trucks, were the backbone, downplaying American vehicles. Declassified staff studies tell why that never squared with reality. As the Germans retreated, they wrecked 65,000 kilometers of track, 13,000 bridges, and 4,100 stations. Railway troops could restore about 20 kilometers a day under fire, and a rebuilt single track carried 6 to 8 trains daily versus 40-50 on a healthy double-track line. Rails stop at a station. Combat units don't. The last 5,100 kilometers, the difference between piles of shells and fire missions, belonged to trucks. The Germans learned the same lesson the hard way. They restored rails brilliantly, then watched supplies pile up at depots while frontline units rationed ammunition. Studebakers deserved the hype, but the full Lend-Lease motor park mattered. The 51,000, 5003 Willys Jeeps changed how commanders moved. Recon got faster, orders got fresher. The 69,000 Dodge 3 or 4-ton trucks gave infantry squads tactical mobility. Another 47,000 Chevrolet 1.5-ton trucks did the daily grind at division level. Marshal Ivan Konev later said the Jeep alone sped up command and control, letting a commander visit multiple divisions in a day. Faster decisions meant faster victories. The campaign to bury the truth started before the shooting stopped. In February 1945, State Defense Committee Order No. 7572 quietly demanded that photos of foreign equipment stay out of print. The victory must belong to Soviet industry. For 40 years, censors literally painted over American trucks in images, swapped them for Soviet models, cut them out of films, and rewrote veterans' memoirs. Stats got massaged. The 1960 official history called Lend-Lease only 4% of Soviet wartime production, achieved by slick accounting that compared U.S. deliveries to total Soviet output, civilian goods included, while assigning ruble values that undervalued American equipment. Editors replaced specifics with fog. Studebaker became truck. American morphed into our. By 1948, Nikolai Voznesensky published reports fixing Lend-Lease at nearly 4% while denouncing the United States. That line stood for 4 decades. Historians faced a choice: repeat what they knew wasn't true, or risk careers, and more. Most repeated. School kids grew up with a story in which their country defeated Hitler almost alone. Museums displayed captured German gear and celebrated Soviet tanks, but left out the humble machines that hauled shells and bread. Then came glasnost. In 1989, Military History Journal printed the Tehran transcripts showing Stalin's private words. It landed like a shell burst. Veterans began to speak freely. In 1990, at a Moscow reunion, former drivers stood and told stories about their American rigs that had been silent for 45 years. The archive doors creaked open. Researchers found 2 sets of books, one for planning, one for politics. The real numbers said that by 1945, American trucks provided 70% of Soviet transport capacity. Dr. Boris Sokolov and others ran the numbers backward, removed the American trucks after Stalingrad, and the big offensives fail. The Red Army's boots marched to Berlin. The trucks under those boots were American. April to May 1945, the battle for Berlin. The logistics appetite was enormous. 2.5 million Soviet soldiers, 41,600 artillery pieces, a storm of ammunition and fuel over a landscape the Germans had wrecked on their way out. Zhukov's first Belarusian front alone needed about 25,000 tons a day. He had 22,000 trucks to do it, 16,000 of them American. In the first week, 2.5 million artillery shells were fired. The ammo moved because trucks made continuous runs under fire. The American trucks averaged 4 100-kilometer round trips per day. Soviet trucks, when running at all, could manage one before breaking. Even the victory parade rolled in style only because the American vehicles looked and worked like they were supposed to. The USSR captured Hitler's capital on Roosevelt's wheels. When the complete ledger of aid finally came together after the Soviet collapse, it was stunning. Vehicles: 427,284 trucks and jeeps, 13,033 combat vehicles, 35,170 motorcycles, 2,328 ordnance service vehicles. Support: 2.7 million tons of petroleum products, 4.5 million tons of food, 4 million pairs of boots, 1 Steinhahn 11 steam locomotives, 11,075 railroad cars. The vehicle deliveries alone outstripped Germany's truck production for the entire war and could have fully motorized 60 rifle divisions. By the end, American vehicles carried 60% of all ammunition, moved 70% of all fuel, evacuated 65% of the wounded, and towed 58% of the artillery. In the first years after, grateful Soviet officers floated ideas for monuments. Zhukov proposed one to the Arsenal of Democracy. The party shut it down. For 45 years, there was no memorial. A modest Lend-Lease monument rose in Murmansk in 2004 and still drew controversy. The cost of the cover-up wasn't just academic, it was memory theft. Millions of citizens lived and died believing their nation fought alone. As the veterans faded, their voices finally honest became artifacts to protect. In 2005, the remaining drivers in Moscow formed the Studebaker Brotherhood. They brought photographs that had been hidden for 60 years, American trucks with Soviet stars. They signed a final statement with 200 names. We rode American trucks to victory. We ate American food. We fired American ammunition. Not to diminish the 27 million Soviet dead, but to honor them with truth. American trucks helped save our motherland. Today, as history gets revised again for political needs, the Lend-Lease story is more than a footnote. New Russian textbooks often minimize American aid even further than Soviet ones did. But the arithmetic doesn't bend. The delivery of 427,184 American vehicles against roughly 205,000 Soviet trucks produced during the war is not an opinion. The private words of Stalin, Khrushchev, and Zhukov sit in multiple archives. The lesson is bigger than one alliance. Industrial capacity wins modern wars. Cooperation, across oceans, across ideologies, defeated fascism. The trucks that carried Soviet soldiers to victory came from the arsenal of a democracy willing to arm an ally it otherwise opposed. This isn't just about logistics. It's about how power is built, how stories are bent, and how truth surfaces anyway. Those 284 trucks and jeeps were the difference between an army tied to railheads and horses, and an army that could run operations across continents. Soviet leaders knew it. Some said it in rooms without microphones. Others said it into microphones they didn't know were there. For 45 years, photos were airbrushed, memoirs edited, statistics cooked. Then Glasnost cracked the seal, and the math marched out in daylight. The Eastern Front didn't just turn on tanks and courage. It turned on wheels, American wheels, crossing oceans and deserts to feed an advance that wouldn't stop. The Studebaker Soviet soldiers, nicknamed Zakaznik, go anywhere, belonged right beside the T-34 in the story of victory. In the end, the trucks outlasted the lies. Engines can be rebuilt. Truth, once it starts, keeps running. And that final irony? American generosity helped build a Soviet power that spent 45 years denying the help. But engines have a sound memory. Put your ear to history, and you can still hear it. The hum of 400,000 American trucks rolling east.